Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Stephen Pitti, Professor of History here at Yale and Director of Yale's Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration. I'm delighted to see you all. On behalf of my colleagues in the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism, especially my friend Maury Samuels, who did so much to organize this event, I want to welcome you to what should be a wonderful discussion with Eric K. Ward that's entitled Skin in the Game: Anti-Semitism, White Nationalism, and the Work for an Inclusive Democracy. Let me also thank Inessa Laskova for her hard work putting this event together. Thank you so much, Inessa. So we have roughly an hour here today together. Let me encourage everyone present to consider putting your questions that you have for Mr. Ward into the Zoom Q&A. And I'll do my best to read as many of them as I can aloud to Mr. Ward at the conclusion of his remarks. So please keep that in mind. Eric K. Ward, a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between authoritarian movements, hate violence, and preserving inclusive democracy, is the recipient of the 2021 Civil Courage Prize, the first American to win that award in its 21-year history. In his more than 30-year civil rights career, Eric's worked with community groups, government and business leaders, human rights advocates, and philanthropy as an organizer, director, program officer, consultant, and board member. Eric's widely quoted writings and speeches are credited with key narrative shifts in recent decades. He currently serves as executive director of Western State Center, as senior fellow with the Southern Poverty Law Center and Race Forward, and as co-chair for the Proteus Fund. Eric, thank you so much for being with us today. We're really excited to have you.
It is such a pleasure to be with you today. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak with everyone. Of course, the question of anti-Semitism, white nationalism, and the threat on democracy in the front of most Americans' minds, whether we are watching the beginning days of a civil trial in Charlottesville, where victims of neo-Nazi violence from the Unite the Right riot are seeking to hold accountable the perpetrators, whether we're looking at the recent arrest and charges of an individual who set fire to a synagogue, or watching with great interest how the federal government will proceed in its prosecution and investigation of the January 6th insurrection. The stress on democracy is very real. The rise of hate violence, the increasing number of Americans who believe that political violence is the solution to our country's problems, and the answer to the question of who is an American and what will America look like are very real. This journey started for me back in the late 80s. I had moved to Eugene, Oregon in 1986. I was part of the punk movement in Southern California at the time, was the lead singer of a band, a garage punk band, ska band, that went on to be known as Sublime. But as we were attending shows, this kind of diverse, creative set of folks who found each other and a new identity through music, we began to notice some of the pressure that was happening within the music scene, within the hardcore and punk scenes. Individuals were showing up in increasing numbers who were calling themselves white power punks and eventually calling themselves neo-Nazi skinheads. And they were very intent on both policing and criminalizing those who they felt didn't belong within those communities. Eventually, I moved up to Eugene, Oregon in 1986. When I moved up, right before me, another individual had moved up from Southern California. He was older than me. He was retired. His name was Richard Butler. And Richard Butler was a retired aircraft mechanic, former World War II vet, and recently retired from Hughes Aircraft. He relocated to the Northwest, not Oregon, but to a place called Idaho, a town called Hayden Lake, and he restarted his Church of Jesus Christ Christian Aryan Nations. The Aryan Nations taught three things. The first was that Jews were the literal children of Satan. The second was that people of color were referred to as subhuman, chattel, meaning humans without souls. And the third was that the Aryan Nations and Richard Butler taught that the United States was to be a new Aryan homeland, and that the Pacific Northwest would be the beginnings of that white revolution. It is in that period that I first came to understand that racism wasn't merely a set of behaviors, that it was also a social movement phenomenon. Eventually, I came to understand that what I was looking at were the emergence of a movement we now know to be white nationalism. I was a young activist then, and I think it's important to say this was before the internet. And as we joined together with others to try to manage this violence and organizing, we collected flyers. Those flyers were often warnings of further violence or harassment. This was a period of great upheaval by the white nationalist movement in the Pacific Northwest. They believed that the Pacific Northwest was the beginnings of that homeland, and they engaged in acts of violence, including the assassination of a radio talk show host by the name of Alan Berg in Denver, Colorado, the murder, beating, death of an Ethiopian student by the name of Mulugeta Sarah, who was attacked on his way home one night from school and beaten to death with baseball bat by neo-Nazi skinheads. These were just a few of the incidences that occurred here in the Pacific Northwest. In truth, much of what the nation faces now was first experienced nearly 3 decades ago here in the Pacific Northwest. At the time, it was hard to get the nation's attention. And in fact, until Charlottesville, it was very hard to get the nation's attention focused on the fact that racism was not only systemic, but a social movement phenomenon, and that those social movements actually pivoted, right, our understanding of what was acceptable in society. But these were the movements we were monitoring. And as we were collecting those flyers I was telling you about, we began to notice something. And those who had done this work before us began to point this out, that all the flyers, no matter how virulently racist, anti-Black or anti-Latino, or no matter how anti-Muslim or homophobic or anti-immigrant, there was always some anti-Semitic caricature of a Jewish figure or symbol on these flyers. It didn't matter whether they were attacking those who had been diagnosed with HIV/AIDS. It didn't matter whether they're going after immigrants or the media, right, or African Americans or Latinos or women. There was always this caricature. And it is when we began to understand one simple truth, which was anti-Semitism wasn't simply at the core of this white nationalist movement, right? That it was the core of white nationalism, and that it was so central to white nationalism that I, as an anti-racist racial justice activist, right, seeking Black liberation, quickly came to understand that we and other marginalized groups would never achieve opportunity and equity if we were not also active in the struggle to uproot this form of anti-Jewish hate. Amongst 21st century white nationalists, right, Jews were being cast in the same role that they had always filled for anti-Semites, as the absolute others, demons stirring a pot of lesser evils, and the driving force behind white dispossession. As I wrote in Skin in the Game, outlining the white nationalist worldview, at the foundation of that movement was an explicit claim that Jews were a separate race. This is really critical for us to hold. What I'm trying to unearth here and lift up is that for the white nationalist movement, right, their hatred of Jews was not a religious form of bigotry. Jews weren't cast as a religion, but as a separate race, right? And it filled the same role, right, that has always been filled by anti-Semites, right? Placing Jews as the absolute other, right? Demons stirring a pot of lesser evils, right? The driving force behind white dispossession. It was an explicit claim that Jews were a separate race, that they weren't white, and that their ostensible position as white was merely a trick, right? The greatest trick that the devil ever played, in the words of the time of a leading white nationalist figure by the name of Pete Peters, who was a counterpart of Richard Butler and his Aryan Nations, right? For Pete Peters and the white nationalist movement, Jews, despite and indeed because of the fact that they were seen as white, were placed as an enemy race that must be exposed and eliminated. It is often why I tell people that anti-Semitism is core to white nationalist ideology. It is central. It is their worldview. It is that fantasy of invisible Jewish power that explains for white nationalists how Black Americans, a race of supposed inferiors, right, could orchestrate the end of Jim Crow, or how feminists in the LGBTQ community could upend traditional gender roles, or even how immigrant workers in this country could mount a challenge, right, successful challenge to economic inequality. Folks often asked me over these last 30 years, right? It was 30 years ago that I attended my first white nationalist meeting, right, to monitor that meeting. The reason I attended was that at the time, again, we couldn't Google things. We had to go sit in meetings. We had to read their writings and listen to their talks. And I simply wasn't going to ask people to do something I hadn't done myself. So I walked into many of these meetings. Now, these weren't the hardcore neo-Nazi meetings. These were the coalitional meetings that looked much like the alt-right today. White nationalists, tax resistors, paramilitary figures, and others who were building, right, the first vestiges of what we now know to be the alt-right. How was I accepted in these meetings? Well, the truth is I was accepted because these groupings, right, saw Jews as their primary enemy, not Black people, not other people of color. Certainly, we were challenges and we were troubled, but we were placed, right, as the puppets of our Jewish puppet masters. They were willing to place me in the role of a potential ally. In the words of one leading white nationalist figure at the time, Louis Beam, he called for a new multiracialism within the white nationalist movement, at least a multiracial coalition. In the words of one of his counterparts in a meeting in Estes Parks, Colorado, leading up to Oklahoma City, one of his counterparts announced, first we deal with the federal government, then we deal with the question of the Jews. That is why a multiracial coalition, right, against the government is called for, in the words of white nationalists. Folks often ask me, where is the anti-Semitism in the white nationalist movement? My response is it's everywhere. When the Tree of Life shooter, right, said Jews were committing a genocide against white people, he was using language that was intimately familiar to his fellow white nationalists. It is such rabid anti-Semitism that is the framework in which this entire movement functions. But let's be clear about something. White nationalists don't bring anti-Semitism to our communities. They merely organize the bigotry that already exists. It is often why I say, as an anti-racist activist, one of the things that is fundamental to my beliefs is that to refuse to deal with any ideology of domination is to abet it. Fighting anti-Semitism cuts off the animating force of white nationalism for the sake of all marginalized communities. In this moment, right, we in this country are dealing with two significant phenomena: the persistent and historic nature and impact of white supremacy, a system grounded on white superiority, the belief that skin color dictates one's place and value in society. It is made up, right, on the false notion that race is a real biological definition, which it is not. What we understand is that white supremacy and the concept of race is a social construct, largely created in order, right, to establish social control in our society. It is what allowed the quick and fast development of the United States into a global economic powerhouse. White supremacy was grounded upon three specific principles. The first was the stolen resources and land of Native people. The second was a system of chattel slavery that was like none other, right? That stripped Black people of their language, their culture, their religions, right? Their very relationships, and reconstructed them into Black Americans. It was those hundreds of years of free labor in this country that positioned the United States as the economic power it is today. But beyond the stolen resources and genocide of Native people, beyond chattel slavery, there was a third pillar in the construction of white supremacy, and that was the control of women and sexuality in society. These were three critical pillars of white supremacy. Then along comes this 1960 civil rights movement. And this 1960 civil rights movement overthrows white supremacy as the rule of law. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not saying that white supremacy no longer exists in America. I can attest as an African-American male that it exists very much in our society. What I'm saying is that previous to the victories of the civil rights movement, white supremacy was the uncontested lens upon which most of us understood society, whether we were talking about culture, politics, economics. Then the civil rights movement wins. It creates other lenses, pluralism, racial justice, lenses of equity, right? And it is in that moment that those who were conditioned to see themselves as superior because of their skin color were thrown into an existential crisis. How could they explain that they lost to those they saw as inferior? That was impossible. To acknowledge that they lost that moral fight would be to acknowledge the agency and humanity of Black people. And that simply wasn't going to happen. Not because people were bad, but because they had been conditioned in every way to see Black people as inferior. So they constructed an answer to this loss. The construction borrowed from the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, a fictional anti-Semitic account from Europe in the early 1900s that was spread by Russian secret police who were afraid of the spread of democracy in Europe, particularly in places like Germany and France. This false narrative, steeped in anti-Semitic tropes, purported to tell a story of Jewish elders who gathered at midnight in a cemetery to plot the takeover of the world, to the control of the economy, culture, finance, etc. Now, we should be clear. This narrative was a strong narrative because it understood that fear and xenophobia towards Jews already existed in society. As I said, white nationalists don't bring anti-Semitism to our communities. They merely organize the anti-Semitism that already exists. Good organizers don't try to inject new ideas in order to galvanize communities. They merely try to tap into the ideas that already exist in a community. So too was it in the early days of the protocol. But it also was a strong narrative. How strong of a narrative were the protocols of learned elders of Zion? Well, we are bombarded with that narrative constantly in unconscious ways, not because people understand the original narrative, but because that is how influential I believe it has been in this society. I'll give you an example. You don't have to read the protocols to actually understand the protocols. I often ask people if they've ever heard of a TV show from the 1990s and early 2000s called The X-Files, produced and directed by Chris Carter. It is a story of two FBI agents who stumble upon a global conspiracy, a conspiracy to infect the body politic through the injection of an alien virus. That aliens have made an appearance and are hiding among humans and are slowly corrupting our leaders and taking control of culture and finance in order to prepare for this invasion. And it is merely two FBI agents who have discovered the truth, and no one believes them. And their job is to wake up the rest of the world to this conspiracy. If you've ever seen the X-Files or many alien invasion stories, you too actually already understand the ground narrative of the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. Now, I have to give a disclaimer here. I'm not here to say Chris Carter is anti-Semitic or even that the X-Files are anti-Semitic. What I'm trying to help people understand is that anti-Semitism functions on a spectrum from the conscious to the unconscious level. If anti-Semitism continues to spread in the United States, if the white nationalist movement taps into it effectively, it is because it is already existent. It's often why I say there is no left or right or conservative or liberal anti-Semitism. There's merely anti-Semitism in society and how we tap into it to build power. And this is my next point. We should understand the white nationalist movement isn't spreading anti-Semitism or even other forms of bigotry in order to spread bigotry. They're merely organizing the bigotry to build political power, to reshape the society. Into what? Well, let me explain. I talked about white supremacy earlier, a historic and present day system of inequality, discrimination, and exploitation. One that still exists, right, in the de facto state and was once the sole rule of law in this country, successfully turned back by the civil rights movement in the 1960s, as I explained. I talked about how those who believed in Jim Crow and separate but equal, right, could not accept that they lost to Black people because they'd been conditioned to see themselves as inferior, right, or superior to Black people. But the protocols became a very convenient answer. For them, they could state that they didn't lose to Black people because, as we said, in their eyes, that was impossible. Instead, they lost to this global Jewish conspiracy. If white supremacy, the system of exploitation, was built upon the paper of anti-Blackness and the genocide of Native people, white nationalism was written upon the paper of anti-Semitism. It's often why I say to people that we must not conflate the two terms. When we conflate a system with a social movement, it confuses us in the tools that are needed to respond effectively to each phenomenon. I often liken comparing or conflating the two to comparing a cow and a Big Mac. Now look, both a cow and a Big Mac are made out of beef. But when one drops their Big Mac on the ground, you don't call a veterinarian. When we conflate systems with social movements, we confuse the necessary tools needed to address both. But there's also another danger, that we get into debates around hierarchy. Which one has more effect? Well, the truth is that both are undercutting democracy in this society. The civil rights movement of the 1960s, through its defeat of white supremacy under the rule of law, brought democracy into full life in the United States. Now, not complete life, so please don't be a literalist with me. Let's understand both social movements and conditions in society unfold and flow along arcs on time. What I mean, right, is that we understand, in the words of John Lewis, that before the 1960 civil rights movement, Democracy was merely an aspiration. The advent and success of the civil rights movement of the 1960s evolved democracy from an aspiration to reality. The role of our generation is to secure and continue to advance that reality. But there is now a backlash. For you see, the white nationalist movement isn't best thought of as a revolutionary movement. It actually is best thought of as a backlash against the victories of the 1960 civil rights movement, a movement that has slowly been growing, right, for the last 4 decades in this country, a movement that has been growing without much response. See, social movements don't appear out of thin air. You know that 1960 civil rights movement I keep referencing? Well, if you talk to actual historians who may be listening on this call, they will tell you without a doubt that the 1960 civil rights movement didn't start in the 1960s. In fact, most of the major victories of the civil rights movement occurred in the mid-1950s. Rosa Parks, Little Rock, Brown versus Board of Education, to name a few. But even as you talk to these academics who are well-versed on the history of the civil rights movement, they will tell you something else, that 1960 civil rights movement didn't get underway in the 1950s, but in the 1930s and 40s. Social movements grow and influence over time. And the mistake we have made as racial justice and human rights activists in this country is that we have assumed that we are the only social movements on the game board of democracy, that we are the only social movements that matter. Our own arrogance has left our communities and the 75 years of sacrifice of those who came for us vulnerable in this moment. You see, the white nationalist movement understands one thing, that a pluralist democracy is its worst nightmare, that a successful democracy that functions, right, that is people-centered, accountable, right, and transparent, undermines the white nationalist fear and existential crisis, right? And what we have to understand moving forward is that we need to reevaluate the importance of democracy. I understand the cynicism. I'm a Black man in America. I understand the rage of mistreatment and the incompleteness of democracy and how it has been used to protect inequality, both here in the United States and abroad. But we also have to understand that the democracy, right, that those who came before us sacrificed, died, and struggled to build, has brought more to this country, to marginalized communities and white folks, than any other ideology to date. We should understand that democracy, inclusive democracy, participatory democracy that makes real this republic is one of the most radical ideologies ever in existence. White nationalists don't like it because the truth is that the democracy that these civil rights activists built has delivered more for white America than white supremacy and the white nationalist movement ever can and ever will. Democracy for the white nationalist movement is a threat because it makes a lie of their argument that race war is inevitable in this country. But we should understand, if we want to know the real threat towards democracy, it isn't the white nationalist movement. We have to be brave enough to pick up the mirror and to take a look in it. I reflect on a rally that took place 4 or 5 years ago now. It took place here in Portland, Oregon. It was an alt-right protest. So counter-protesters showed up, and so did others. At one point, as I was monitoring this rally, trying to understand what the level of mobilization was in the city, I noticed an alt-right activist sitting down. And there was a guy with a camera who had it shoved in his face and screaming at him and demanding that this alt-right white nationalist activist explain why he was here in Portland. Didn't he know the city of Portland didn't want him? Didn't he know counter-protesters didn't want him? Didn't he know the mayor of Portland didn't want him here in the city? And why was he here? The cameraman demanded an answer. What this white nationalist activist said is worthy of us paying attention to. He looked at the guy and he said, I've heard we're not wanted here. But the truth is that Portland, he said, is a shrinking Black population by both percentage and whole number. It's a true fact. He then went on to say, you can say you don't want us here, but you're doing something we could never get away with. You are actually disappearing the Black people of Portland, Oregon. That was his response. In short, he was calling us hypocrites. You see, each day that we allow systemic inequality to exist in our society, we further mark ourselves as the hypocrites of a pluralistic, multicultural, multiracial democracy. When we leave unchecked the issues of segregation in housing, in employment, in education, in health, we do the work of white nationalism. We help lift it up as the alternative. We are in a moment of great populism in this country. Very few people are interested in the status quo. Why? The status quo has not benefited the majority of Americans, whether they are people of color or white. People want and demand new ways of walking through society. The answer that the status quo is sufficient is not a sufficient answer. Instead, we have to make real the promise of a multiracial democracy, one that people can practice and taste each and every day. If we don't do this, let's be clear, people will increasingly choose the vision of white nationalism. Why? It's one that everyone understands. When I say the words, make America great again, you don't have to ask me what that looks like, what that sounds like, what that feels like. We see it each and every day, and we knew it even before the words were uttered. But when we say inclusive democracy, when we say a pluralist society, we have not set visions of what that looks like. We have to understand people will pick the future that they know, even if it is unhealthy for them, over the unknown nearly every time. It's important that we continue to move forward to make our society responsive and to bring opportunity to all Americans. But the white nationalist movement understands something else too, that anti-Semitism isn't just an attack on the Jewish community. It is a way of undermining belief in democracy by providing a conspiratorial worldview that provides very simple answers and allows us to put our fears onto a small community, the Jewish community. But it's not just in that way. We should understand as people of color, immigrants, and women, that anti-Semitism is as much of a physical threat to us as it is the Jewish community. Whether we are talking about attacks, the mass shootings in El Paso, targeting Latinos at a Walmart, or the targeting of Sikhs in Wisconsin, or the targeting of African-American churchgoers in Charlotte, South Carolina, or the targeting of Jews in Pittsburgh. In each case, the killer believed that they were engaging in an existential war with the Jewish community. That's because anti-Semitism, as I said before, is not merely a set of behaviors, but an ideology and a worldview. I think I am not exaggerating to argue that most mission-oriented hate crimes in the United States were largely driven by anti-Semitism, regardless of who the actual victims were. So those of us who are non-Jewish have to understand that we are as much at risk to anti-Semitism as the Jewish community is and the democracy that we have struggled to build. So how do we move forward? First of all, we need large, vibrant, national debates on anti-Semitism. It means leaning into courageous conversations. Until we as a society start naming anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitic tropes, we will continue to play them out as unconscious bias, both individually and as a society. Because anti-Semitism denies the agency of marginalized communities with legitimate grievances, anti-Semitism becomes a convenient excuse by those who seek to backlash and to clamp down on the push for racial justice in this country. And finally, anti-Semitism provides simple answers to the complex and nuanced conversations we need to be having. Understanding anti-Semitism helps protect you from the dog whistle politics that are in play. When we hear terms like globalist or Eastern establishment, or even the media being bandied about, those who are well-versed in the tropes of anti-Semitism understand many of the conversations that are happening, right, at a conscious level. But let's be clear, at the unconscious level, all of us are being impacted by these anti-Semitic narratives. So we move forward and open up the space for discussions on anti-Semitism. That means not being so quick to treat everyone as if they are David Duke or Louis Farrakhan. It means understanding, right, that as we learn and practice anti-Semitism, we are likely to stumble and make mistakes. But if we unfairly, penalize people because of their mistakes, we will shut down the very conversations we need to have in this moment. As I've said, as a racial justice activist, one cannot fight racism in this country without being willing to experience it. None can fight anti-Semitism, another form of racism in this country, without being willing to experience it. It is the unfair burden of moving towards a more equitable society. Lastly, I want to say this. We have to understand the moment we are in right now. We live in a country right now where synagogues are being attacked. They are not alone. We are in a society where they are being set on fire. Where Jews are being attacked on the streets of the United States. The Anti-Defamation League, the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI have documented record numbers of anti-Semitic crimes being reported over the last 2 years, increasingly so. We have to recognize the moment we are in. We cannot fight racism in this country without also tackling anti-Semitism. And we can't tackle anti-Semitism without tackling racism. If the injury and the assault on 140 law enforcement officers on the Capitol steps of Washington, D.C., with little fanfare or reaction, does not tell you what moment we're in right now. I fear nothing I'm going to say in the question and answer period will convince you. But I will leave you with this last final word, your role in this moment. When I was a kid, we grew up very poor. And by summer, most I and my other friends were out of resources. And you usually find us sitting outside of the apartment building on the lawn. Every summer, we would remember this game we played called If I Were. And we'd sit in a circle, and if I were driving down the middle of a freeway and the brakes went out, here's how I would respond. And we'd argue about how we'd respond or how we wouldn't. What would we do in that moment? If I found myself in a lion's cage, how that would happen, and the lion came out, here's what I would do. But you know what question we would always say every summer? If I were in the midst of the 1960s civil rights movement, here's what I would do. And boy, would we argue about what we would or wouldn't do. We didn't understand the choiceless choices of our parents. We didn't understand what it meant to grow up under Jim Crow, separate but equal, the hardcore racism of the 1950s. So we were full of bravado about what we would or wouldn't do. That question has always haunted me. What would I do in the midst of the 1960s civil rights movement? You may have played similar games with similar moments in history. What would you have done? Well, it occurred to me about 5 years ago that I actually no longer needed to ask that question, and neither do any of you. The truth is this: whatever it is we would have done in the midst of the 1960s is the same thing we are going to do when we leave this talk today. Make it count. Many people have sacrificed to bring us to this very moment, right? The gateway to a multiracial democracy. It won't come easy. There's no 30-minute sitcom where everything gets tied up nicely. This calls for real work and commitment. To save democracy, you first have to love democracy. To save the United States of America, you first have to love the people in the United States of America. That's what this moment calls for. Courage, leaning in at a time of great complexity, understanding what is it that you will do for the 21st century civil rights movement. Make it count. History will judge you, and what you do in this moment matters. Thank you. And let's take some questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Eric. Really appreciate your hard work here and always. We do have a number of questions that have come in, so I'm going to do my best to send them your way verbally. And I would just remind our guests in the audience to please continue to submit questions via the Q&A if they have any for you. One question that's come in asks you to talk a little bit more about dog whistling. And you noted terms like globalist or the media that have become important stand-ins and dog whistles for anti-Semitism. And I think the question asks in particular how you think this persistence of dog whistling, or perhaps the new forms of dog whistling, might change how people think in the university, how we think about education, how we think about the work that educators and students are doing in 2021, 2022. Any thoughts?
Great question. Look, I think we see a number within the area of anti-Semitism. We see a number of dog whistles that are often put into play, right? The idea that somehow the Jewish community exerts more power and control in a society, right? In society, we see that in rhetoric across the political spectrum. I just think last week or the week before, former president, Mr. Trump, right, made a statement about how Israel, right, controls the United States and policies of the United States. Now, he said it as a philo-Semitic statement, right, seemingly positive, right, like when people say Black people are so articulate or dance so well, right? These seem like positive comments, but we understand, right, that they are merely reinforcing racist tropes. So we see this often, this idea of invisible Jewish power. That is a significant trope. The other is blood libel, the idea that somehow Jews are sacrificing children or the vulnerable in a society with no care. These are the two predominant tropes, but there are a number of historic tropes. I should say, right, for those who study anti-Semitism and who are far better experts than I think it's important to note, right, that we all understand that these tropes predate the origins of anti-Semitism, right? Anti-Semitism is a specific form of anti-Jewish bigotry, and it is an ideology, but these tropes are very active in modern anti-Semitism, and it's why we need to understand them. I think checking out of the library, right, or getting a book by a good academic who looks through the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, right, is a good place to start. Most of the tropes are existent in there, and if we understand the tropes, we can then recognize them when they're in play, and we can point them out. We have, for me, I understand by way of example, and then we'll go to the next question. If someone starts talking about thugs, right, I have an idea to start paying a little bit more attention to what they're saying, because I understand, right, that thug is often a dog whistle right, towards Blacks and Latinos. In the same way, we have to become literate in the language of anti-Semitism. Until we do, all of us will be manipulated by it, no matter where we sit on the political spectrum.
Thank you very much. The questions are coming in fast and furious. We have a question here that asks about how white nationalists and what this person calls white wing populists do invoke the discourse of civil rights when discussing the supposed dispossession of white people or the supposed silence of conservatives. Can you talk a little bit about this and whether you see it as a cynical ploy or in some other way?
Look, we understand from the inception, right? Anti-Semitism, the narrative of anti-Semitism paints a picture that Jews are seeking to destroy European Christendom. In the United States, right, race became much more of a primary identifier than religion. So instead of destruction of European Christendom, right, it became the destruction of white Christendom here in the US. That is how anti-Semitism is largely defined. We should understand that that continues to mainstream itself, right? It mainstreamed itself from the term white genocide to the chants in the streets of Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us, right? To Tucker Carlson promoting the replacement theory, which is just a retelling, right, of the protocols through anti-Semitic tropes. At the end of the day, demographics are changing in the United States, right? We are a diverse society going through a significant demographic change. That creates demographic anxiety. Anxiety, right, to demographic change is actually natural. We who are I put myself on the progressive left, that's where I sit on the political spectrum. This applies across the political spectrum. We do a terrible job of managing demographic anxiety. We actually tell people, right, that that anxiety is unnatural, right, or it's bigoted. But the truth is all of us experience demographic anxiety. We experience anytime we walk into a room of people we don't know. All those feelings you're feeling are demographic anxiety. We need to stop treating people, right, as if they are David Duke because they are feeling the change of a society. On the other hand, though, white nationalists are exploiting that demographic anxiety. They are telling those who are experiencing it that it's not natural, right? It's not natural to feel that anxiety, that it's an existential crisis, and that they need to prepare to defend themselves against that existential crisis by arming themselves and preparing for a race war. We should understand that in the midst of great change in a society under stress, COVID, economic instability, right, political violence, climate change, that people will begin to believe that unless we put forward real policies, right, that desegregate this society. It is why segregation and racial profiling are the most significant national security threats in this country today. What we understand about demographic anxiety is that it can be managed. It doesn't go away, right? But one learns by putting themselves in unfamiliar environments over and over again. When you are afraid, when you have anxiety around flying, right? Counselors don't tell you to stop flying, right? What they tell you is to start flying more, right? That there's a way to kind of manage that anxiety. So we have to get better in terms of public policy in understanding that the current inequality in this society is killing American democracy. There is no bigger threat. And in terms of the management of the white nationalist movement, it is racial profiling that is the largest national security threat. For months, right, law enforcement in DC understood that white nationalists were coming to that community in an attempt to disrupt the electoral process of the United States. Yet on that day, we saw them not in population, crowd control, right? We saw them in very passive stance. Why? Because the folks who were marching on that day weren't Black. or Latino, right? They didn't see them as a threat. And as a result, they allowed 140, right, of their fellow officers to be injured, and 5 people were killed. It is that kind of racial profiling, that unconscious bias, that is leaving the rest of us at risk. So these are the issues we have to contend with in this moment. Demographic change is real. That will continue to happen. How do we manage demographic anxiety? And how do we get our policies to deal with the underlying segregation that exacerbates that anxiety in our society?
Thank you. We have several questions that I think are essentially asking about white nationalist leadership. And I think there may be a way in which some people here may have heard you focusing on a sort of white nationalist leadership that might have been somehow more community-based, more working class. And so several of these questions are asking how you think about the importance of wealthy donors. The Koch brothers is mentioned in one question, and other forms of leadership, including people who are actually quite enfranchised in society and might be pretending to speak about those who are not, but about whom that could not be said, applies to them.
Yeah. I think often we project things onto right-leaning movements that we would never accept for our own movements on the left, right? We would never say that our movements are controlled by rich philanthropists because we receive foundation grants. We would never suggest, right, that we are being manipulated by political elites above us. We treat our opposition with a level of arrogance that is astounding to me and doesn't speak to the real issues. The truth is this, that the white nationalist movement is putting out an effective message. And those who say that they're trying to create alternatives have failed to do so, right? Now, there are lots of challenges and there's lots of reasons why the white nationalist movement has more wind in its sails. It's not just a failure of an alternative, but our ability to get serious about this moment and understand that this is not a question right now of economic inequality. It doesn't mean that economic inequality isn't an issue, that this is an issue of governance, right? Who gets to belong in society is the key question that the other side is debating right now. And it is not just top down, that is grassroots up. We see it. I often talk about this, and this may be what people may be speaking to. I refer to a professor by the name of James Aho, University of Idaho, in the early 2000s. And I think perhaps even till today, he's one of the few individuals who has done a substantial look at the white nationalist movement. He's a sociologist. He published his findings in a book called The Politics of Righteousness, Christian Patriotism in Idaho. So look at the white nationalist movement in Idaho. And he finds some interesting things. He finds, for instance, that the white nationalist movement in Idaho has a higher level of income than the general population of Idaho as a whole, right? That it is more highly educated than the general population of Idaho as a whole, right? That is not unique. When we look at authoritarian movements outside the US, we see that same trend, right? We should not think that because there are more working class or working poor people in these movements, right, that these are working poor, working class movements. That just has to do with the demographics of the United States. There just happens to be more working class and working poor people to draw from. The truth is that these movements are disproportionately, right, made up of upper middle class individuals. But right, they're not manipulating people who are working class and working poor. It's that working poor and working class folks are choosing one of the few alternatives that are being presented to them. Look, we haven't done a good job on the racial justice side, right? We have not sent the message, right, that white people are also part of our formula, right? Our way forward. And until we do a better job of that, right, people in the midst of anxiety are going to cling to whatever they believe makes them more stable. And in a racist society, right, a society with unconscious bias, it is going to be the movement with bias that wins out in that race, unless we come up with better, more broader visions of what we mean when we say America and Americans. So I would just say at the end of the day, yes, these movements are being funded through lots of diverse sets of sources, but I wouldn't be so caught up on who's funding who. I would be more focused on building real community, real mass-based movements on the ground that actually speak to people's needs and the conditions they are living under right now. That's what's needed. We spend way too much time focused on the days of the white nationalist movement rather than the tools needed to protect, defend democracy, and manage this white nationalist threat.
Well, that's a good transition then to several questions that have also appeared, which really are asking you to think aloud, if you would, about strategies for the left or for progressive people. As people think about building those coalitions, as people think about speaking back, about raising fundamental questions about the embeddedness of anti-Semitism in national politics and more, folks are asking what gives you optimism and where you think people's energies ought to go. There's a question, for example, about how we name these movements and how we name these struggles for justice with anti-Semitism and many other things in mind. And others are asking questions, for example, about the place of labor unions and other, at least sometimes, progressive forces. So could you talk a little bit about how you think about this strategically? Thank you.
Yeah. So strategically, I would argue that the most powerful wind we have in our sail is actually space and time. And that almost sounds contradictory in the urgency of this moment. But what I mean by this is we have to understand something, I think, really critically, right? That this is a backlash against winning, right? It is the racial justice movement that is winning in this country. Look, Black Lives Matters, the movement in this country, in most polling that was done previous to 2021, I haven't seen much polling for 2021, but previous to 2021, right, Black Lives Matters was polling more support, right, by percentage of white America than ever supported Martin Luther King Jr. in his lifetime, right? Black Lives Matters was receiving more support from white America, right, than the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the sit-ins that took place in the 1960s as well. Now, look, we can look at those numbers and be sad that it's not 80% of white America, right? But quite frankly, we should be more shocked that in a society that so socializes people to other by race, that such a significant portion of white America would be polling in support of Black Lives Matters, and that it's greater than it was in the 1960s. That's an arc, right, towards equity and opportunity in this society. Again, look, I didn't grow up. I grew up in Southern California. I grew up very poor. I grew up through most of junior high school and high school, right, in a motel, right, that my mom paid for the room by the week. So I'm not a big fan of the 30-minute sitcom, right, where everything gets tied up so nicely in the very end, and all the answers get questioned, all the questions get answered. Everything's so fair and happy. I don't know that world, right? And I don't think very many people in this country or in this world know that world. To know that world where things get tied up so quickly and simply is just a world of privilege that is beyond my understanding. Where I live, where the most people live in this country, look, struggle is a part of advancing humanity. That's what it means. And you know what? It's terrible we have to do it. And we shouldn't have to do it so hard. but we really do. That's the job before us, to make it easier for the next generation, right? Those who are yet to be born, right? To continue the path towards opportunity. This means, in my mind, right, letting go of this idea that simply because I demand a right, that it's simply going to be given to me. And I think it's just not how history is unrolled, and it's not how real life unrolls. So look, we have to get serious. We have to understand that we have to continue to advance a vision verbally of where we want to go. We have to get very pragmatic about those things that have been built. We have to stop rolling our eyes. I remember in the early parts of the Black Lives Matters movement, right? There was a great shirt. I actually love this shirt because I'm an old punk rocker, and I kind of like sarcasm, right? And there was a great shirt that said "Not My Mama's Civil Rights Movement." And folks may remember that. And I like that shirt because it denoted, right? This was a new generation that had a new set of demands. And what was unique about Black Lives Matter, and what is unique about Black Lives Matters, is that they understand the things they are asking for aren't wins, right? As someone told me, right? These are basic rights that shouldn't even have to be asked for, right? How should you even have to demand the idea that Black lives matter, right? How is that even a controversial statement in 2021? And so they were very pragmatic in understanding, right, that there was a very specific conversation that they were attempting to generate in the United States. And I think they did so very successfully. We need more pragmatism like that in the left, in the racial justice movement. Here's the second thing. We have to admit, right, that we really stumbled in this moment. For 30 years, we ignored the rise of this white nationalist movement and its impact. We rolled our eyes at it, right? We laughed at it. We laughed at those who warned about it. And we need to ask ourselves, how did we make such a stumble? If we can't ask and answer that question amongst ourselves, right, how are we to understand and ensure that we don't make those same mistakes moving forward? So there needs to be much more internal dialogue around who we are as movements and exactly where is it that we are trying to go. And until we can answer that question, we can't expect the rest of America to guess it, right, for us. But there's a third piece here. I've often said that the goal of the white nationalist movement isn't to target people of color or Jews. Yes, they do, because it's effective at sending a message, right? It's effective at creating the political theater that generates the conversation they want to have in the society. What I try to tell people all the time is the real target is government, right? It's not people of color who are under attack. It is the government of the United States. It is the city of Charlotte, the city of DC, the city of Portland, Oregon, the city of Los Angeles, California. It is actually government that is under attack. And we have to begin to mobilize in a way that demands that government defend itself and defend American people. And we don't take that seriously. It means also entering government, learning how to govern, understanding policy, the boring day-to-day work, right, of maintaining, right, a democracy. It's not as fun as marching. It's not as fun as making signs, right? But it is the work that is needed to be done for the next generation. We have to stop thinking, right, that we are the gods, right, that recreate society into our liking. That is a fantasy. That's not how the real world works. How the real world works is that we invest our dreams in the next generation, and we urgently create space for that next generation. And that means sustaining democracy. And that means taking governance seriously in this moment. Elected board members, how many school board members are running unopposed this year, right? A record number. And then we're surprised, right, that these faux attacks on Black Lives Matter under the umbrella of critical race theory are taking place, or that educators and principals are being fired for talking about the Holocaust or slavery. It's because we are shirking our duties, right, as change makers in our society. We got to get serious. If we don't take ourselves seriously, no one's going to take us seriously. We got to stop performing and start leading.
Thank you, Eric. We're going to need to let you go. I'm aware of that. We do. Let me ask you at least one more question. If you have a second. Somebody asked a follow-up question to the question that I addressed, and I think it's trying to strike at the question of how advances in one area don't put to the side important advances elsewhere. And so the particular question is about how in activism surrounding BLM over the last few years, many Jewish activists and supporters may have felt that they became very involved in these struggles and helped to push for justice, equity, and end to police violence and more in the very recent past. But at a moment virtually simultaneously in which anti-Semitic violence and anti-Semitism more generally also appeared in the United States and elsewhere in the world, may not have felt that Black activists, Latinx activists, and others stood similarly with them to contest anti-Semitism in its violent and in its quotidian forms. How do we do that work of assuring that, again, an important focus that comes on our radar for very urgent reasons doesn't in turn sideline or eliminate from view something like anti-Semitism as it emerges and persists?
Yeah, I would quickly, I want to point folks to an essay. I throw my writings up on I think it's a Medium because I'm kind of a DIY, right? I said an old punk rocker. So I just throw my writings there. I just have this feeling, who's gonna publish these writings? And so I just throw them up there. There's one I want to direct folks to, like if you Google my name and the essay, Somebody Must Be Blamed, Anti-Semitism, the Equal Opportunity Ideology. So someone must be blamed, and Eric Ward, this fuller essay will pop up. But one of the things that I say that I think is critically important here is that anti-Semitism is emerging, right, as an equal opportunity ideology, right? Anti-Semitism crosses every line of race, political party, right, primary stance on a wide range of issues. Like at the time, I think I said, like the coronavirus, right? This virulent ideology disproportionately impacts the Jewish community, but in fact imperils us all. I went on to say that the Jewish community is actually right to be concerned in this moment of populist impulses across the ideological spectrum, right? From the grievances that propelled a B-list reality TV star into the presidency, right, to the cry of justice that brings throngs of people in the streets in defense of Black lives. Historically, right, the populist movements have always fed on and in turn fueled attacks on Jewish people, right? The Jewish community has a historical right to be suspicious of populism in the same way that the Black community deserves the right to maintain its suspicion of law enforcement in this country, right? These are historical documented tensions and understanding. And I don't think the Jewish community needs to say much more to us about why it is suspicious and concerned about populism. Now, look, the onus is on non-Jews, right, to make this right. And the way we make it right is by showing up on anti-Semitism, right? If there are law enforcement that I have to engage in conversation, right? Law enforcement that individuals, right, not the system, but individual law enforcement who I know have done some thinking on race and how it functions in a society, right, have a different set of relationships with me than law enforcement who I know don't, right? And in the same way, right, if we want the Jewish community to understand we're serious about anti-Semitism, it means we have to start tackling anti-Semitism. But I want to say something to the Jewish community, and particularly those who are white presenting, right? And it's simply this. You're exactly right. We can both be the victims and perpetrators of bigotry at the same exact time, right? We have watched as a disproportionate number of Black figures, right, have come into the limelight around controversies around anti-Semitism. If you understand the nature of anti-Semitism and how it functions, it's actually not surprising, right, that a disproportionate number of Black and Latino individuals, right, vulnerable, marginalized communities, tend to express the most virulent forms of anti-Semitism. It's actually anti-Semitism by design, right? The purpose of anti-Semitism, one of the roles in Europe, right, was to create a buffer in society between the haves and the have-nots, so that when the have-nots got frustrated, they were allowed to take their frustrations out, not on the haves, right, but this Jewish buffer. They were allowed to other and add all the nefarious things that were happening in the society onto that Jewish community. That was the pogroms, right, of the 1800s and earlier in Europe. Well, that same theory of change still functions here in the US, and it's often why we see it. But I want to say something else, right? We also have to acknowledge that even as we condemn the anti-Semitism, that unconscious racial bias, right, anti-Blackness plays out in these conversations, right? It doesn't make us bad to admit that these different dynamics are happening at the same time. I can tell you, as a person who wrote his first essay, right, on anti-Semitism back in like 1992, 91, right, that Black folks who stumble on anti-Semitism receive a different level of response, right, than non-Black folks who make similar stumbles. And I'm thinking right now of I'm spacing on his name right now, so apologies. The NFL player, Deshaun Jackson, who made some really incredible, horrifying anti-Semitic statements on Twitter and to the press. And during that same week, Madonna said something offensive and anti-Semitic. So did Chelsea Handler, I think it was. Excuse me if I got that name wrong. Said something equally atrocious. But there was only one person who received attention, and that was Deshaun Jackson. That is the unconscious bias that exists in society. Now, look, I'm not saying Deshaun Jackson didn't deserve that attention. What I'm saying is that if you're going to give that attention to Black perpetrators of anti-Semitism, make sure you're giving the same equal treatment and heat, right, to white perpetrators. If we don't do that, right, we're creating wedges. But on the racial justice side, if we dabble in anti-Semitic tropes, right, if we aren't disciplined in understanding that anti-Semitism is a form of racism, and if we are about racial justice, if we are anti-racist, we have to oppose all forms of racial justice. We are also creating wedges between two communities, right, that have traditionally been the bedrock of civil rights in this country since the 1950s. We each have to be more responsible, stop pointing fingers, and understanding that all of us function in an unconscious biased society. It doesn't make us bad people. What makes us bad people is being too lazy, right, to learn what these are so that we can try to avoid them, because our children deserve that from us.
Thank you so much, Eric. I think we're going to leave it there. I want to thank you for alerting us to what you called these stumbles over the last 30 years that, of course, you've been working so hard to address across 3 decades now, and doing so much for all of us, for helping us to understand better what's now at stake, the importance of thinking about anti-Semitism within broader concerns about democracy in the United States and worldwide, and about anti-racism as a fundamental concern of all of us. And why, in your words, it's important to show up in the right ways when it comes to anti-Semitism as a core concern for all of us. Let me just underscore for everyone who's here that Eric's writings are posted on Medium, as he mentioned, and I'd encourage folks to read those articles carefully, where I think you'll find even more to think about and answers to some of the questions we weren't able to get to here verbally. Let me thank, in conclusion, my colleagues at Yale's Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, and also the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism, especially my colleague, Maury Samuels. Eric, thank you so much for your leadership, for your presence here today, and we'll look to you in the years to come to continue to be a leader on these questions and so many others. Thank you.
I look forward. Thank you so much.